Okay, today I'm delighted to be speaking to Nicholas Alexander of Fallow, a credit trading platform for the offsetting market. We'll dig into that in a minute, but first of all, thank you for joining us, Nick.
Thanks for having me, Gareth. Pleasure to be here.
So let's start at the beginning. How did you get started in sustainability issues?
It's been a while. Maybe I'll take a step back and explain kind of my background.
Yeah.
I started my career actually in international development. I have a background in economics and human rights, and I started working for the public sector for the UK, specifically working out of Geneva, working at the UK mission to the UN. A lot of the issues we covered were international development, global health related, but we very much had a kind of a public sector prism. What I realized, however, is that the most effective programs were actually those that engaged with the private sector,
Mhm.
and things like advanced market commitments for vaccines, so on and so forth. After a stint of working as a diplomat and then working at the UN, I decided I wanted to try my go in the private sector, specifically focusing on sustainability issues. Sustainability and climate has really come to the fore in the last 3 to 4 years. And so I did an MBA to kind of skill up on the private sector and then work on climate. Specifically within climate, climate is such a broad thing. I really wanted to work on market-based mechanisms to address climate change. I'd seen, obviously, the pros and the cons of kind of the philanthropic model, the public sector model, and I was really interested in kind of what market mechanisms and kind of alignment of incentives could do to address the climate crisis, which got me here.
Yeah, which brings us neatly on to what Fallow does. So perhaps you could explain what the platform's all about.
Great, great. Yeah, absolutely. We're a relatively new company. We launched roughly 2.5 years ago, but broadly speaking, we exist to scale climate action. And to do this, we operate within the voluntary carbon market. As many of your listeners may know, the voluntary carbon market is kind of a contentious market, but it should be very important for net zero. So maybe take a step back and explaining how it will be important for net zero. A typical corporate strategy obviously aims to decarbonize as much as possible, but there'll always be these unabatable emissions. And the voluntary carbon market is one of the important mechanisms in which they can address those unabatable emissions now by financing climate action. The problem being is that the market's broken, right? It lacks traceability, transparency. It doesn't really scale well, and there's a lot of questions on the kind of integrity of the projects being run. And so when we looked at it 2.5 years ago, we said, okay, well, what can software do? What are the lessons that software has brought in other markets that can be applied to this market? And what can we build that is something more that creates a system that's, broadly speaking, more efficient, more scalable, and more fair, and ultimately that drives more financing to projects. So, it's a two-sided market. There's different ways of accessing the market, but broadly speaking, it's about empowering project developers, primarily in the global south, but really across the spectrum, to sell directly to buyers in the global north.
Mhm.
Typically the buyers in the global north. It's about empowering the buyers in the global north to access these projects and build high impact portfolios without needing to go through intermediaries who are typically found in London and New York. And it's also about empowering channel partners to integrate climate action into their products and services. So the likes of sustainability consultancies, carbon accounting firms, but even things like e-commerce. What we see is a future whereby high impact carbon could be ubiquitous in goods and services everywhere, such that you're engaging in climate action on the daily basis without even thinking twice about it.
Yeah. I was first involved in carbon offsetting about 20 years ago. I've always taken a pragmatic approach. I don't agree with the sort of George Monbiot view of it as a sort of buying indulgences for your sins in medieval Europe. But the issue that we had then that doesn't seem to have been entirely fixed is, additionality and, as you say, transparency and traceability. And, we've had gold standards and various other attempts to address those. So what does your platform do? You said the market was broken. How are you adding reassurance into the market?
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I mean, I think there's several levels to it, right? So one is about providing a platform for financing that is traceable and transparent, right? So too often when you go and try to purchase carbon offsets, you're dealing with a broker who might have inventory, opaque pricing. You don't know how much money is actually going to the project, and you might not actually know that much about the project itself. Data is very asymmetric and opaque. We try to make all of that data transparent. But also, if you think about, one of the contentious issues with carbon markets is that is the issue of environmental claims, right? So things like carbon neutral claims, net zero claims, so on and so forth. One of the problems here is that because the market isn't regulated, there isn't a kind of a rule or a consensus as to how to make a robust environmental claim, either as a corporate or even as an individual. And so what our platform allows every entity to do is have a super robust audit trail from the environmental claim being made, whether that be net zero or kind of any other claim or a contribution compensation, all the way down to the certification in the registry. And because we've built the technological infrastructure between those two pieces, between the buyer and the seller, with the registries and the standard setters in the middle, we can really provide a robust audit trail. And then perhaps finally is one of access, right? So there are lots of marketplaces in the market, but very few of them allow you to kind of build portfolios that suit every ESG need, right? So real estate companies will be interested in different types of projects than, for instance, an e-commerce firm, which might be, looking to support the reforestation of the Amazon. So because of this kind of nuance and the complexity around the market, what we do is we attract all of the supply by being completely free. So anyone can onboard, anyone can list their projects, and they won't have any transaction fees from us in order to list and sell their projects. And that allows us to cater to all of the different demand side profiles that you might get and build portfolios that suit every ESG need.
But clearly there's a big challenge in, providing reassurance because, as you say, it's a global industry. A lot of the projects are in the global south, and often the more contentious ones, and have been found in the global south. And we see newspaper articles saying quite frequently challenging the claims by some of the companies providing the carbon credit or selling carbon credits. So when you say super robust and transparency, to what degree can you, short of having people out on the ground,
Right.
measuring areas of rainforest and check, what practically can you do, I suppose?
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, well, maybe I'll take a step back and kind of address, the common criticisms that you mentioned. So, outlets like, for instance, The Guardian have raised a lot of awareness about some of the carbon offset projects that have not held up to scrutiny with regards to impact that they claim. Now, first of all, I welcome that scrutiny, right? This is a nascent market. It's a growing market, and sunlight is the best disinfectant. That's the expression that's often used, right? However, one shouldn't throw the baby out of the bathwater just because there are a few rotten apples, right? Typically, the contentious projects are avoidance projects linked to, for instance, REDD+. There's a kind of it's quite tricky to measure impact in these types of projects because you're actually measuring impact against a scenario that did not happen. So you're building baselines and forecasts and so on and so forth. So the science is maturing over time, and there's a lot of disagreement as to how best to do it. What you can say for certain is that the methodologies and the safeguards are improving over time. And the entities that do that work, so the likes of Verra, Gold Standard, as well as the third party, what are called VVPs in the market, they're getting better and better at doing it. and the technology that they utilize is getting better and better. So it's a journey. There are still projects that don't meet quality expectations that one would expect in the market. But that's not a reason to throw away one of the best tools we have for climate action. Now, what we do at Fallow is that we're only able to list credits that are issued by what is called ICROA accredited registries. ICROA accreditation is basically an accreditation released by IETA, the International Emissions Trading Association, that raises the quality bar in the market. So they have this ICROA accreditation. The registries have to pass it with a lot of robust kind of stringent due diligence procedures. And then we only list credits that are able to pass those bars. Then, in a market where no consensus on quality has been achieved, we don't want to be the guardians of quality, nor do we wish to claim that all of the projects listed on Fallow are the best projects, right? The jury's still out as to what quality means in the market, but that's now beginning to change with things like the release of the core carbon principles and the VCMI's code of conduct for the carbon market, which I'm happy to talk about a bit.
Yeah, well, go ahead if you. I'm interested because all of this is quite new to me. As I say, I was involved in this 20 years ago, but not so much recently. So, yeah, if you dig into some of those new developments, that would be great.
Yeah, absolutely. So, I think maybe taking a step back and explaining how carbon market projects are developed, right? So, a carbon offset is often misunderstood because it does have a fungible layer, which is 1 ton of CO2 avoided or removed from the atmosphere. That is similar across all carbon projects, right? And that's what you're equivocating for when you do a carbon offset. It's that 1 ton of avoided or removed CO2 emissions. However, within that, there's a plethora of different methodologies. So you have afforestation, restoration, soil carbon, mangroves, biochar, enhanced rock weathering. And all of these are completely different types of projects. But they still have this kind of underlying equation that each standard unit is 1 ton of CO2 avoided or removed. Now, some carbon credits sell for $500 a ton, others sell for $3 a ton. And that speaks once again to the variety of carbon credits in the market and that the kind of difference in qualities you'll find. Each carbon credit and each type of carbon credit falls under a different methodology. And right now, the big policy change this year is the release of what's called the core carbon principles. So this is an independent standards body called the ICVCM, which released the core carbon principles. And what they're doing is a really robust analysis of each methodology to ascertain whether the carbon projects under this methodology really do have the impact that they claim. So this is going to be a huge test for the market because as far until now, there hasn't really been this consensus on what quality means on the supply side. Shifting to the demand side, there is also something called the VCMI's Code of Conduct. And this is more about the claims made by corporates and the best practice that they need to follow in order to make those claims. So what does a robust carbon offset strategy looks like? What are the kind of safeguards that they need to do? And how can you make sure that the carbon claims being made are verifiable, auditable, so on and so forth? So both on the demand side and on the supply side, there's these huge policy improvements that are coming into the market that we can adapt into our own software, so to speak.
Yeah, I was very taken when you said there's the range of carbon credits were from $3 a ton to $500 a ton. That's extraordinary because one of the additional arguments for offsetting is that if a company offsets, it's an internal voluntary carbon tax, which should push them towards lower carbon options so they don't have to offset. And certainly I could see $500 a ton doing that. But where's the incentive, I suppose, to pay, more than 2 orders of magnitude more for your carbon credit than the cheapest?
Yeah, I mean, that's a very good question. So I think that what maybe first answering a question that kind of perhaps you inferred about was, this idea that companies will seek to engage with the carbon market as a means of avoiding decarbonization,
Hmm.
which is on paper super super problematic. Now that one could see how that logic is applied. However, study after study has shown that the entities that engage in the carbon market, so the biggest buyers and the people who per emissions factor buy the most carbon credits, are actually twice as likely to decarbonize as those who do not.
Hmm.
So if you think about it, the logic is inverse, is people who are already decarbonizing are the ones who are engaging in the carbon market. So they're really throwing all the tools they can at this problem. And then separately, to answer your second question, which is about why would you purchase, 500-ton offset when you can do the same thing for three. I think it's because companies, especially leaders in these companies, want to do the right thing. They want to do the right thing for their stakeholders. They want to do the right thing for the communication purposes. Maybe it's selfish, but the right thing is engaging in voluntary, robust environmental action. And that sometimes means financing carbon removal projects, completely innovative direct air capture projects that are just coming off the ground that require huge capex and opex financing. And then, that's why they cost so much, because each carbon ton generated will currently cost $500 a ton to make it viable. But those economies of scales will kick in over time, and those costs will be reduced. It's important to note that, if you look at the IPCC, SBTI, everyone agrees that carbon removal is going to need to take a huge acceleration towards in the latter years, 2030, 2040, 2050. And unless you invest in carbon removal now, we're not going to get there.
Well, that's an interesting thing because it was a question I had in my head was most people have set net zero targets on those decades, 2030, 2040, 2050, with a few in 2045 for some reason. 2035 doesn't seem to be as popular. Don't know why. But do and you said it was a growing market. Do you see any either problems or opportunities for a sudden gold rush, for carbon credits as we start to hit those sort of iconic dates that people have chosen for their net zero targets?
Yeah, I mean, it really depends who you ask. So there is an echo chamber in the voluntary carbon market of experts, pundits, so on and so forth, who really believe that this market is due to take off. And the logic is as follows, right? Corporate climate commitments are, accelerating massively. So I forget the stats, but I think something like, 50% of the global revenue of like the top 2,000 companies in the world is covered by a net zero commitment, right? But the problem being is that climate action for these corporates is not keeping a pace. So what's going to happen is around 2030 or 2035 or whenever these targets really start hitting in, because typically they're kind of it's not like a hard target in 2030. It's obviously linear. They have to reach those even as of next year. So once those targets start hitting in, and once corporates realize, oh dear, we're not even close to hitting our decarbonization targets, they're going to have a lot of unabatable emissions that they have to address. So that's from a voluntary basis. If you throw in the kind of addition of regulation, so country after country, region after region, wherever the kind of the legality of it sits, more and more geographies are looking to push carbon regulation, and such that these companies will actually almost be forced to engage in either the compliance market or the voluntary market to achieve their those climate commitments. So they're probably not going to meet their own commitments. The voluntary market will be one of the only opportunities for them to do so. But the problem is the supply and demand dynamics of the voluntary market aren't super flexible.
Mhm.
In what I mean by that is that, for instance, an afforestation project, so planting trees in native habitats and preserving biodiversity, for instance, this type of project, if financed, so financing is an issue, can take up to 7 years to start issuing carbon credits.
Mm.
So there's a huge time lag between that. So if the crunch hits in 2030, but companies haven't been financing the projects until then the limited supply that will exist will all of a sudden shoot up in price because there will be such a squeeze on that supply. So that's why you're seeing kind of record levels of investment going into nature-based avoidance and nature-based removals now, because companies and also kind of financial institutes, asset managers, so on and so forth, they're realizing that the supply and demand dynamics are going to change hugely in the next 5 to 6 years, especially around 2030.
Yeah, because obviously we're already within that 7 year time
Yeah.
frame for 2030. Yeah, and that was that's something I was going to ask, but it sort of gets complicated because you were talking about the range of sources of carbon credits and the range of pricing appropriate that comes with that. Is will the supply keep up with the demand? As we go forward, is it to be a matter of going back to what we were saying before, that we may find that the limited supply of carbon credits means that companies are going to be pushed into more decarbonization?
Yeah, I mean that's very much a possibility, right? Because if the carbon price is high externally, then that means the opportunity cost for internal decarbonization is less so. So either way, a high carbon price is a good thing for the environment, and it's probably a good thing for the advocates of sustainability within corporates, right? So there's different mechanisms for accounting for carbon. But what I think is also kind of important to highlight is that carbon accounting in and of itself is undergoing a revolution now, whereby it's becoming easier and easier for corporates to account for at least scope 1 and scope 2, but then also soon scope 3. And so once these kind of, whether it be digital platforms, whether it be kind of new agreed consensus on how to account for carbon, it's going to be a lot easier. And that's also going to go in tandem with government regulation on disclosure, right? So, the sustainability ecosystem is changing hugely because of the requirements of disclosure for large corporates. And naturally, it will only make sense to disclose both the carbon accounting, but then also the kind of the nature of the carbon offsetting corporates are engaging in.
Yeah, because the trite criticism always thrown at offsetting I talked about before is you can just do business as usual and pay somebody else to extract carbon, but the reality I think we've been touching on quite a few times is much more complex than that, both in terms of cost and if you want to do it robustly. The traceability, etc., etc. This. The more I dig into it, the more it doesn't seem like the easy option that it's portrayed in the press. But
Yeah,
yeah. And I don't know whether it'd be interesting to see when we hit 2030 whether there's a massive pushback into it may be cheaper to cut carbon, because again, when I've dug into some of the carbon removal projects, and you're talking about $500 a ton, it is a very expensive way of cutting the carbon in the atmosphere compared to cutting it at source, it seems to me. So I'm very intrigued at how that market plays out in the long term.
Yeah. What I can tell you is that right now, so the carbon removal market, so as I mentioned, there's avoidance and then there's removal. The carbon removal market right now on the demand side is dominated by relatively few buyers with high willingness to pay but relatively low emissions. So you're thinking Microsoft, Stripe, and others. These are typically software consultants, software companies with huge, huge budgets, but not relatively low emissions per kind of on a revenue scale. So these entities are taking carbon removal very seriously. But what will be interesting is to see whether that demand side will diversify. And one of the kind of interesting ways that the carbon market now is evolving is also the ability to build portfolios.
Mm-hmm.
Right. So typically, imagine if you're an SME in the UK and you want to offset, you want to do the right thing, but you also want to finance carbon removal, like a biochar project in the UK.
Yeah.
If it's at £200 a ton and you have even as low as 100 tons, that's a lot of money to be spending on just carbon offsetting. So what you can do with carbon portfolio management is that you can finance carbon removal in as much as possible, and then supplement your portfolio with other projects that might be cheaper. So nature-based removals like afforestation that go at $20 a ton, or even cook stoves projects that have a lot of social benefits associated with the project. But then you bring your weighted average cost per ton down to something more palatable, say $25 a ton, or even less than that, while still financing these kind of let's call it lighthouse projects that would otherwise have been attainable. And that's one of the benefits that we hope we're bringing to buyers, is this ability to kind of scan the market and only purchase what you need in line with your own kind of SBTI or net zero strategy.
Yeah. Well, going on to the company, how much competition is there in the marketplace for services such as your own?
I think there's definitely, if you Google carbon marketplace, there's loads of entities, right? I think there's lots because people see the opportunity there. They see the same problems and they see ways to fix them. I would argue that not many of them are doing things right. Not many of them are doing things in a future-proof way. And what I mean by that is, for instance, typically if you go to a kind of carbon marketplace, either they take inventory, so they purchase carbon offsets and resell them as an intermediary, so almost like a broker, or they don't actually have the carbon credits in inventory, or they can't guarantee delivery, and as such they're selling something that they might not even have, that they have maybe a loose relationship with a supplier. Both of those things are problematic. So if you have inventory, then that entity has an incentive or a bias to sell that inventory, right? Because if the buyer comes and says, "Well, I don't want that. Why should I buy that?" Obviously you're going to say, "Well, this is the best project. I did due diligence on it, highest quality in the market." Natural. So that's not good. So if they don't take inventory and they don't actually have these carbon credits in their ownership or in their custody, then they can't guarantee traceability and they can't guarantee delivery. Traceability, as we know, is super important because I think something like 50% of retirements, so when you take a carbon credit out of the market, are done anonymously. So that begs the question, is like, who's retiring these carbon credits anonymously, and who's actually making the environmental claim for those credits? So once again, that's also problematic. So in contrary, our model is a custody model. So we take custody of the carbon credits, but not legal ownership of the carbon credits. So it's completely free for suppliers to come list. However, they do have to give us custody of the credits such that we can guarantee that audit trail and we can guarantee delivery. But we also don't have a particular bias as to what people purchase. So we can attract all this diversity of supply. We can guarantee delivery and we can guarantee auditability, which, as far as I understand, is kind of unique in the market.
Yeah. And sorry, this actually going back to one of your previous answers as well, just you were talking the portfolios of carbon credits. Do you provide those as packages, or is it up to the user to decide, I'll go for a certain amount of carbon removal, a certain amount of afforestation, or do they come as a package?
So the simplest way is to do it as a package, but people always have preferences, and that's a good thing, right?
Yeah.
Because they should be allowed and they should have the flexibility to purchase what they want. So a typical demand side conversation might be, okay, do you have any particular objectives in mind? Is it for CSR? There's a little thumbs up there. Do you have a CSR objective? Do you have a weighted average cost? Do you have a specific geography? Is there any kind of mix between avoidance and removal? So there's a certain kind of guiding questions that help the entity navigate the market and understand their own preferences. And then essentially, I use the software to build a custom portfolio bespoke that meets their needs.
Right. Good. And I suppose, this is an area, all of net zero is an area of great innovation and and business opportunities. But what lessons have you learned from entering it?
Okay, well, I think coming from the public sector,
Yeah.
which was very slow moving, very bureaucratic, but also had large amounts of money and financing at play. I think I would say that I took three lessons from my stint so far working in the climate/startup space. The first is to be patient, right? So if you're not patient, then you're not going to find your kind of perfect customer. You're not going to find product market fit. And you're not going to find the real problems that you're trying to solve. So don't rush into any solution because you read a market report that suggests that there's a particular problem. Speak to customers, take time with the product, and really work out something that should add value. A second lesson I would take is, people or everything, right? We work in the software space. And so, it's very tech focused and it's actually not necessarily that people focused. However, in my short time working at Thallo, at least, what I've realized is that, it's smart, passionate, engaged people that really drive progress, both internally within the company, but also externally. So you're really going to, want to work with some of the best people that you can. And once you find those best people, really latch on, find value, and drive impact wherever you can. And then maybe similar to the first one is, don't follow the hype. Carbon credits is an interesting market, but there's lots of other interesting markets. Carbon accounting, there's a huge amount done. Carbon removal. So don't jump into something just because it sounds cool or financially attractive in the long run. Really think about where your value is most contributing to the goals you want to achieve, and then obviously balancing that with your personal and professional goals. So. Yeah, those would be my three go-to lessons.
Fantastic. That's great advice. So I think that just leaves me to thank you, Nic, for coming on and digging sometimes quite deeply into the voluntary carbon credit market and associated issues. If anybody's interested in Thallo, it's thallo.io on the web. I'll put the link in the show notes as well, so you can click through and see what Nic and his colleagues are up to. But thank you very much for joining us today, Nic.
Thanks, Gareth. Appreciate it. Cheers.